Morning, everyone. Welcome back. It's May the 25th. It is a nice day outside, it looks like. Um, Hope you all had a good weekend. Um, I realized this morning that I had forgotten to post how the rest of this year is going to go. I said I promised that I would, or maybe I didn't promise. I mentioned that I would, but I did today, so it's up there. Today we're going to continue our look at Unit 5. Today, tomorrow, and Wednesday, I'll post videos. Um, that way we can, get through the unit. Then the 27th, so Wednesday, I'm going to post a project, kind of like what we've been doing, similar to the other units. There is no written response for this unit. I'm just going to wave that one to the side. And then on Monday, June the 1st, to June the 5th, we are going to do every day, we're going to do a lesson so that we can finish Unit 6. Just so that's the next week to the 12th. You do not have to have any sort of lectures or new information because I want you solely focusing on finishing things, because June the 12th, the last day I'm going to accept anything from you. My marks are due the week after that, and I don't want to be scrambling with things, so I'm giving you this deadline. So let's respect the deadline and work towards finishing it. So that being said, let us start. We're on student activity 34. This is page 9 in the Unit 5 booklet. The impact of the pursuit of national self-determination. That is the topic that we're going to discuss today. We're going to focus it on this question of how has self-determination influenced Canada. So we're going to look at how different groups within Canada have had different self-determination goals, or their self-determination is different than that of the greater population or the greater Canada, and how that has influenced Canada. Because like we talked about at the beginning, the first unit, when I introduced these concepts of nationalism and self-determination, we understood that Canada is a civic nation. Our citizenship is what creates us as a group of people called Canadians, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we are completely in agreement or we're all on the same trajectory, because we also talked about non-nationalist loyalties, and for some people those are more important than the idea of Canadian nationalism or even ethnic nationalism. Ethnic national ties can pull them away from this idea of Canadian self-determination. So we'll see that today. The terms that we're going to introduce, or the concepts, or even the ideas, is Quebec nationalism, First Nations, and Métis and Inuit self-government. So these are the three things that we're going to discuss today in depth, and you're going to see how these peoples and their ideas of self-determination are very different from that the Canadian government's idea, and there are examples of when they come into conflict. So we're going to take a little bit of a stroll through the history of Canada today and look at how, as a country, we've been influenced by these sort of by these opinions and these beliefs. So on slide 28, you can watch a 6-minute video on Quebec in the 20th century. I give it a watch because Quebec in the 20th century is fairly interesting. When we talk about things like conscription crisis during World War I, World War II again, the Quiet Revolution, their touch and their brief stint with what I would almost argue is ultranationalism with the FLQ, and then the referendum and all these sort of things. So it's quite interesting. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start today with Quebec, this Quebec nationalism and sovereignty movement. So, by the 20th century, Canada's immigration policy had set the pace for a multicultural nation, but many felt their needs were not being met. So, Canada was bringing in peoples from all over the world, people from Europe, from Asia, from Africa, from the Pacific, They were all making their way to Canada. The Francophone population, who had been there since the time of Jacques Cartier and New France, was shrinking rapidly, and therefore their partnership previous therefore the partnership previous governments had made was threatened because they weren't as big a concern now. So before this multicultural wave began, they were the, I guess you could almost say they were the they were the minority, but like they were the main minority. When more and more groups start coming in, they start to seem less important, they feel. So the Francophones have three options: accept their new position as one of the many ethnicities or cultural groups within Canada, promote a vision of Quebec as a strong autonomous province within Canada, or promote a vision of a sovereign Quebec. So they can either accept it, they can advocate for themselves more, and gain a little bit more independence per se, or they could take the last step, which is full-on independence from Canada. So many in Quebec were suspicious of the government's policies regarding immigration, as they believed that most immigration would be integrated into an Anglophone society, making the existence of a Francophone even harder. So you can look at all the other provinces that we have. And if they're bringing in more and more people, the population of these provinces starts to go up. And then the population of Quebec, it's outnumbered in terms of when it comes to, say, voting on certain issues. So there was that concern on the part of Quebec. This image here on slide 29, this is actually the referendum verdict. So you can see 49.42% said yes to leaving, and 50.58% said no, and no meant staying in Canada. So we're going to see the how we get to that point. So Henri Bourassa, I hope I said that right, a member of parliament between 1896 and 1932, believed equality between Francophone and Anglophone should be equal, and later was significantly opposed to conscription of the Francophones in, quote, British wars. So when we talk about the conscription crisis during World War I, this is the sort of people that were opposed to it. Because remember, Canada joined World War I not because they had the choice. They were still a part of the British Empire, and they were forced to join. Now, they see it as this is a British war. The British got themselves involved when they made that treaty with the Belgians, and then when Belgium was invaded, they had to go to war. So the people in Quebec thought this wasn't their fight. Fast forward to the mid-20th century, Premier Maurice Duplessis, I hope I said that right, fought for greater autonomy and focused Quebecois on the traditions and values of the church and community. So we have the premier now in the mid-20th century who is strengthening the ties of the church and community. So he's very much trying to strengthen the focus of the people of Quebec on what makes them different. Because if you remember from your grade 7 and your grade 9, the language and the religion of Quebec was different from the rest of Canada, and that was one of the reasons that when the American Revolution happened, the British were afraid that the French were going to join the revolution in the colonies, the next, or what would soon be the United States. So they gave a lot of concessions, and they gave a lot of things to Quebec. In 1959, many Francophone Quebecois were ready to embrace what was to be called the Quiet Revolution. They wanted to modernize Quebec by improving social programs, the education system, but they also wanted to affirm French language and the culture of the province. So they were trying really hard and focusing on their idea of self-determination, our language, our religion, our culture. in the greater Canada, they were going to stick to theirs, not um, align themselves with the rest of Canada. Uh, for some, sovereignty was the only solution. They saw, you know what, we're not getting anywhere as a part of Canada. We need to become our own country. That way, we can impose our own self determination a lot more without having to check ourselves against the federal government. So in 1978, the Parti Québécois was formed by a man named René. I can't even say that last name. Levesque. In the same year, Pierre Trudeau, the now prime minister's father, was elected prime minister. He was a Quebecois, but his vision was a federalist one. So we have two things happening in that year. One, a separatist party is founded in Quebec, and at the same time, a prime minister is elected from Quebec, but he is not focusing his attention on, the self-determination of Quebec. His self-determination and his line of vision is on a whole self-determination goal for Canada. Um, in 1979, his government promoted two languages in a pluralistic society, and passed the Official Language Act, which protected the language rights of Francophones. So, for those of you that still eat cereal, one side is going to be English, one side will be French, or they'll be on the same side. We can thank the Language Act for that, to protect the rights of the Francophone people. So, it's a concession that was made by the whole of Canada to help promote the self-determination of the Francophone Quebec. So that's kind of a brief history of Quebec. When we get towards the 90s, that's when we see the referendum held, and people are actually voting to leave. And we saw it was such a close call, but again, almost 51% said no, we want to remain a part of Canada. So it is still a thing. The Bloc Québécois, the political party that exists that won a lot of seats in this recent election. It usually depends on how their leadership is, but if the leader is very much for separatist policies, you see it more felt in Quebec. So that was Quebecois self-determination. Now we'll focus on the other major self-determination movement in Canada, the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit self-government. In Canada, Indigenous nationalism revolves on the right to self-determination. So when we talk about things like religion, language, culture, and land, and the idea of self-government, because the government that we have now, even the language we use, the House of Commons, that is pulled directly from Europe, right from Britain, planted it in the New World. The ideas and the form of government that was here before is very different. So we have very much imposed a European style structure, parliamentary system in Canada. So this idea of self-government would look very different. The main idea with self-government, it also relates to the relationship to the land and traditional ways of life, so hunting, fishing, and trapping. These sort of traditional ways of belief and lifestyle, they don't match nicely with the parliamentary system that we have, because not all of us do the same sort of have the same sort of lifestyle, and it all depends on where you live. If you live in Vancouver and you live in Edmonton, or you live in Regina, your life is very different depending on where you live, because a lot of different things play a part of it. But that is very separate. We're going a different way. I'm going to cut myself off, and we'll come back to self-determination for the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So we're going to roll back time to when John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister, was still around, and his vision of expanding Canada was made possible by the government's 1870 purchase of Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company. So if you're looking at the map on slide 31, that's essentially all that blue area in the middle. That was all purchased so that the part in the red could spread itself all the way and go back and reach British Columbia. But fun fact, that land wasn't unoccupied. That land had hundreds of thousands of indigenous people living there who had lived there for thousands of years. And now here they are having to, they've been, essentially their land has been bought from underneath them, and now they're going to have to live with it to an extent, and we're going to see. However, this purchase ignored, like I said, the Métis population that made up 50% of the population's area. Taking up arms in 1869 and 1870, they were led by many different people, one of them being Louis Riel, forced the government to address their concerns. The Manitoba Act created the province and recognized French and English as equal, and provided 566,000 acres of land specifically to the Métis. So, the Manitoba Act created Manitoba as a province. It wasn't the same size as it is now, but this was the first, push of Métis self-determination. In this little province, which they called a postage stamp province because it was small, they specifically said, we want English and French to be equal, because Métis was a mixture of indigenous and European, usually French. So their religion and their language needed to be recognized as equal to the English, and the Manitoba Act did that. Obviously, we're going to keep pushing more west. There were disagreements over land, and the pressure of immigration shifted the balance so the Métis were outnumbered. And despite Louis Riel having another sort of physical battle with the Canadian government, the Métis' dream of self-determination was shattered. So as time progresses, more and more people are coming to Canada from Europe, and they're pushing more and more east. The more and more they push, they come into those contact with those Métis who are again forced to move more and more and more. They take a final stand along Alberta, Saskatchewan, and there was the Northwest Rebellion, where Louis Riel and the Métis stop and say, this is as far as we're going to go. The Canadian government gets involved with the military. There is a battle. They lose, and this idea of self-determination is shattered. So yes, they had success with the Manitoba Act, but that was it, unfortunately. Today, the Constitution recognizes Métis as an Aboriginal people with a common history and traditional land and culture. And they have reemerged as a nation that desires self-determination. But unlike the First Nations, they were not forced onto reservations, and therefore their land base is scattered. So they are now recognized as a part of the First Nations people. However, because they're in that middle ground, because they are a mix, they don't belong to the reserves and reservations of the First Nations people. So they're more of a scattered group, but they still exist, and there is still that call for self-determination for them as well. Fast forward a little bit, 1876, we get the Indian Act. The Indian Act was passed by the Canadian government, and essentially what the Indian Act says is it decides who is Indigenous and who is not. And it's based on things like blood and percentage of Indigenousness. So really it is deciding who's going to get the benefits of it. Because it protects First Nations well-being, and it guarantees in treaties, but also designed to encourage assimilation because it's telling you who and who is not. So a lot of Indigenous rights are protected, but it's now also giving the Canadian government the right to say, you're not Indigenous enough, so therefore you are not. You're going to join Canadian society, even if you don't like it. So that's why we get things like residential schools. The act was amended several times, but rarely was the First Nations consulted. So they've made some alterations, but the people that it affects, they're never included. You want to parallel this to one of the units we talked about. When we talked about World War I, the Treaty of Versailles that ended the First World War, the Germans were not included. They were just waiting in essentially the waiting room. The Allies come out, they slap the thing on the desk and say, sign this, and that's it. And then we saw what happened. Fast forward almost 100 years, actually more than 100 years, the First Nations unite in the National Indian Brotherhood that pursued Prime Minister Trudeau, his father, not the current, and the Minister of Indian Affairs, Jean Chrétien, who was the Prime Minister when I was growing up, to abandon their decision to ignore federal treaty obligations, a huge stepping stone in Aboriginal rights in Canada. So they made a very strong stand that the government had been dropping the ball and they weren't going to stand for it. So the Canadian government had to step up its obligation. Today, many First Nations are in the process of settling land claims, which often involve asserting their right to traditional land and to govern themselves. So probably one of the success stories of that would be the province of Nunavut. So in the north, we have the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. When I was, I believe it was the 5th grade or the 6th grade, that's when that province or that territory became its own. And it's designed and it's run based on the Inuit who live there. Their self-government is the success story that exists in Nunavut. Their structure is very different from all the other territories and provinces of Canada, and it is shown to be a success. However, in other provinces and stuff, we don't see the same sort of success story. So, to summarize, because that's basically it for today, how has self-determination influenced Canada? Well, we've seen in Quebec and in the First Nations and Métis self-determination that there is not one self-determination for Canada. It is a very mixed bag. The two main ones besides this so-called Canadian self-determination is the Quebecois self-determination and the First Nation self-determination. We have seen that they have both, on the rise, came into conflict with what the Canadian government, the Anglo-Canadian government, was trying to do. And the Canadian government had to give concessions. They had to give up certain things because they were running the risk of causing some serious divisions within Canada if they didn't. So that's it for today. Hopefully that made sense. If it didn't, please feel free to ask questions. Continue working on things. The offer still stands. If something is not making sense or a project isn't making sense, let me know, and we can either have a group Zoom chat or individual Zoom chat to alleviate some sort of confusion. Thank you for those who've actually reached out and done that. It was very nice to see you. Hopefully I was able to help you. I feel like I did because I've seen the work that you've done afterwards, and it's very well done. So that's it for today. Keep in mind, I will make another video tomorrow because Wednesday will be done with this unit. And remember, June 12th, keep that date in mind. And I guess that's it. So I'll see you tomorrow.